The first thing Wallace Doyle saw was the horse stumbling, and the second thing he saw was the woman sliding from its back like something already dead. He had been riding the fence line along the northern pasture that morning, checking for the breaks the winter had left behind, when the sound of hooves too slow and too uneven to belong to a healthy animal carried across the sage flats. Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1879 was a country of wide silences, and any sound out of place in it was worth riding toward. What he found was a bay mare with its head hanging low and its ribs showing through a coat gone dull with dust, and on its back, a woman who had stopped bothering to sit up straight, swaying with the animal's gait as though her body had simply given up arguing with gravity. She went down before he reached her. Not a fall so much as a folding, her knees buckling first and the rest of her following after, and Wallace was off his own horse and running before he had decided to run at all. "Ma'am," he said, kneeling in the dirt beside her, and when she did not answer he pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat the way his father had taught him to check a calf that had gone down in a bad birth, and found a pulse there, thin and quick, like a bird's heartbeat trapped under her skin. Her lips were cracked white at the corners. Her dress, what had once likely been a decent blue calico, was gray with trailed dust and torn along one sleeve. She could not have weighed more than 100 pounds soaking wet, and she was nowhere near soaking wet. She was dry as the country around her. "Hey now," he said low, the way he spoke to spooked horses. "Hey now, I've got you." Her eyelids fluttered. For one moment her eyes opened, and Wallace found himself looking into a pair of gray-green eyes, so exhausted they seemed to have gone past fear into something quieter and sadder, an emptiness that had run out of even the strength to be afraid. "Please," she said, so faint he had to lean down to catch it. "Don't let him," and then she was gone again, slack in his arms, and Wallace Doyle did the only thing a man raised right could do. He gathered her up like she weighed nothing at all, because by then she nearly didn't, and he carried her to his horse, and he rode for home with one arm holding her against his chest and the other holding the reins, and behind them the bay mare followed on its own, too spent to do anything else. His ranch house was 2 miles further on, a good solid structure of hewn logs and a fieldstone chimney that his father had built 20 years before, back when the whole of this country had still belonged to Buffalo and to the Crow and Shoshone bands that hunted through it, before the railroads came and before the fences went up, and before Wallace Doyle had learned, at the cost of considerable grief, exactly how much a man could lose and still keep breathing. He laid her on the bed in the small room off the kitchen, the room that had been meant once for a nursery, and he sent old Tobias riding hard for Larkspur to fetch Doc Prout, and then he sat beside her with a cup of water and a cool rag and waited, feeling more useless than he had felt in a long time, which was saying something. Doc Ezra Prout arrived within the hour, a spare, gray-whiskered man who had been patching up the town of Larkspur since before it had earned the right to call itself a town. He examined her with brisk, careful hands, listened to her chest, checked her pulse and the color of her gums, and finally straightened up with a grunt that Wallace had learned over the years to read as cautiously hopeful. "She's dehydrated bad, and she hasn't eaten proper in some days by the look of her," Doc Prout said. "But there's no fever, no wound I can find beyond scrapes and bruising, and her heart's strong enough. She's young. She'll likely come around, Wallace, but she needs water in small sips and broth when she can take it, and she needs rest that nobody's going to interrupt. You understand me? Nobody." "I understand," Wallace said. The doctor gave him a long look, the kind that had nothing to do with medicine. "You know who she is?" "No idea," Wallace admitted. "She said something before she went under, something about not letting him. I don't know who him is." "Well," said Doc Prout, packing his bag, "when she wakes you'll likely find out. In the meantime you might send word to Martha Sinclair. A man alone with an unmarried woman in his house is going to get talked about in this county whether he likes it or not, and the woman's got enough trouble without adding gossip to it." Wallace nodded slowly. Martha Sinclair was a widow who ran the small dry goods store in Larkspur and who had, in the 2 years since Wallace's own wife had died, taken it upon herself to look in on him with a persistence he had learned to accept rather than fight. She would come, and she would be exactly the kind of steady, unshockable presence a frightened woman would need. That evening, with Martha Sinclair installed in the kitchen rocker with her knitting and a lamp burning low in the little room off the kitchen, Annie Yates opened her eyes for the second time and did not immediately fall back into darkness. She was aware, first, of a ceiling made of hewn logs, and second of the smell of wood smoke and beans cooking somewhere close, a smell so ordinary and so unlike hunger and fear, and running that for a long moment she could not place where she was or how. She had come to be lying beneath a quilt that someone had clearly stitched with care, years of care, small flowers worked into the corners in thread gone soft with washing. "There now," said a voice, and Annie turned her head to find an older woman sitting near the bed, gray hair pinned back neat, a pair of knitting needles moving steady in her lap. "There you are. You gave us all a fright, young lady, riding in on a horse half-starved same as you were." Where Annie's voice came out as barely more than a rasp, Martha Sinclair was already lifting a cup of water to her lips before she'd finished the word. "Small sips," Martha said. "Doctor's orders. You're on Wallace Doyle's land, about 2 miles out from the town of Larkspur, Wyoming territory. He found you collapsed on his north pasture this morning and brought you here. And I don't imagine you'll find kinder care anywhere between here and the Missouri River, so you can put your mind at ease on that score." Annie drank slow, the water almost painful going down, and when she had taken what Martha allowed her, she lay back against the pillow and let her eyes close, not from weakness this time but from something closer to relief, an emotion so unfamiliar after the weeks she'd had that it took her a moment to recognize it. "I don't have anything to pay him with," she said finally. "You're Mr. Doyle. I don't have money. I don't have much of anything." "Nobody's asked you for payment," Martha said, not unkindly, though there was an edge of firmness in it too, the tone of a woman who had heard a great many hard-luck stories in her years behind a store counter and had learned to separate the honest ones from the rest. "You just worry about getting your strength back. The rest can wait." It was 2 more days before Annie was strong enough to sit up on her own and take solid food, and on the 3rd morning, with the spring sun coming bright and slanted through the small window, she finally met the man who had carried her off the pasture. Wallace Doyle was, she thought when he came through the door with a bowl of broth balanced carefully in both hands, not at all what she had imagined from the little Martha had told her. She had pictured, somehow, an older man, weathered and gruff in the way of ranchers she had known back in Kansas. Instead, the man standing in the doorway of the little room was perhaps 30, maybe a few years past it, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who worked cattle and fences with his own hands rather than hired them all out, with dark hair that wanted cutting and a face that might have been called stern at rest, but that softened, unmistakably, the moment his eyes found hers open and alert for the first time. "Miss," he said, and stopped in the doorway as if uncertain whether he was welcome. "You're awake proper now. That's good. That's real good." He set the bowl down on the small table beside the bed with a care that seemed almost exaggerated, as though he were afraid too sudden a movement might startle her back into sleep. "You're Mr. Doyle," Annie said. Her voice was stronger now, though still thin. "The doctor's woman, Mrs. Sinclair. She told me you're the one who found me." "I am." He pulled the room's single wooden chair a respectful distance from the bed and sat, his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers in a way that struck Annie as more nervous than any grown man his size ought to be. "I'm glad to see you sitting up. You gave us a scare, riding in the way you did." "I don't remember much of it," Annie admitted. "I remember the horse slowing down. I remember thinking I ought to get off before I fell off. After that it's mostly dark." "You said something," Wallace said carefully, "before you went under about not letting somebody. I didn't press for more, figured that wasn't mine to ask unless you wanted to tell it. But I'll say plain, if there's a man out there you're running from, you're safe here. This is my land and nobody sets foot on it uninvited." Annie looked at him for a long moment, weighing something behind her tired eyes, and then, because the kindness in his voice was so plain and unhurried, so unlike anything she had been offered in longer than she cared to remember, she found the words coming out of her almost before she had decided to say them. "His name is Silas Grier," she said. "He held my father's debts. When my father passed this winter it was the influenza. Took him quick. Thank the Lord for that much mercy. Silas came to the house within the week and told me the debts were mine to settle now, and that the only settlement he'd accept was my hand in marriage. There wasn't a paper my father signed that I ever saw giving Silas that right, but Silas had papers of his own, and a lawyer friend in the county seat, and nobody in Ellsworth County was going to take the word of an orphaned girl over the word of a man with money and friends in the courthouse." She stopped, her hands twisting in the quilt, and Wallace said nothing, only waited, and something in his silence, the fact that he did not rush to fill it with reassurance or advice, gave her the room to keep going. "I was to marry him inside a fortnight. 2 nights before the wedding he came to the house drunk, and he said things, and he laid hands on me in a way that told me plain enough what kind of husband he meant to be, debts or no debts. So I took my father's horse and what money there was in the tin box and I rode. I didn't have much notion of where I was going. Just away. West mostly, because that's the direction the sun goes down, and I figured a body could always find more country that way." Her mouth twisted in something that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I didn't plan well. I ran out of the little money I had somewhere in Nebraska, and after that it was mostly luck and whatever I could trade for, and the horse and I both ran thin as fence wire. I don't rightly know how far I've come. I only know I couldn't stop, because stopping meant thinking on what I'd left and what might still be behind me." Wallace Doyle sat very still through all of it, and when she finished, he did not tell her she'd been foolish to run alone across half a territory with no plan, though he thought it, and he did not tell her she was safe now in the easy way a man says such things when he hasn't considered what safety actually requires. Instead he said, "That man had no right to any of it. Not your hand, not your father's debts passed on to you like you were a piece of the estate to be settled. There's no law in this territory, nor any territory I've heard of, that makes a daughter answerable for her father's debts in that fashion, whatever papers he claims to hold. You did right to run." "Doesn't feel like doing right," Annie said quietly. "Feels like I ran because I was too scared to do anything else." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Wallace said. "A body doesn't have to be brave in the way of standing and fighting to be brave. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when a fight isn't a fair one, and getting yourself somewhere it might be." Annie looked at him for a long moment, and something in her chest, some tight and guarded thing that had been clenched since the night she'd left Ellsworth County, loosened by a fraction, though she would not have been able to say exactly why. "I mean to earn my keep here, Mr. Doyle," she said, lifting her chin slightly, some old pride reasserting itself now that the worst of the exhaustion had passed. "I won't be a charity case. Soon as I'm able, I'll work for whatever bed and board I take from you, and then I'll move on and trouble you no further." Wallace considered this, turning his hat brim once more between his fingers before he answered. "I've got more chores on this place than I've got hands to do them, truth told. Tobias is a fine hand, but he's getting on in years and his knees give him trouble come damp weather, and I've been meaning to hire a cook and housekeeper since." He stopped himself, and something passed briefly across his face, quickly smoothed over. "For a while now. If you're willing and able once you're strong enough, there's honest work here. Mending, cooking, the garden, the chickens. Real work with real wages, same as I'd pay any hand. Not charity. I don't believe in charity between grown folks who both have something to offer. I believe in fair trade." "You'd pay me wages," Annie repeated, as though testing the words for a trick hidden inside them. "I would. And you'd earn every cent of it because I intend to work you same as I'd work any hand who wasn't pulling their weight. There was the faintest ghost of a smile at the corner of his mouth now, the first she'd seen from him. "Though I expect I'll go easier on you the first week or two, seeing as you can barely sit up without the room spinning." Annie found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling back, a small and rusty thing, unused in longer than she wanted to admit. "I accept the terms, Mr. Doyle." "Wallace," he said. "Folks around here just call me Wallace." "Then you'd best call me Annie," she said. "Annie Yates." "Annie Yates," he repeated, as if setting the name carefully into some private ledger. "Well then, Annie Yates, eat your broth before it goes cold, and we'll talk chores once you've got some meat back on your bones." It took the better part of 2 weeks before Annie was strong enough to do more than sit in the kitchen and peel potatoes. But Wallace never once made her feel the slowness of her recovery as a debt accruing against her. He brought her books from the small shelf in his own bedroom, mostly agricultural almanacs and a worn copy of a Shakespeare his mother had carried west with her. And in the evenings, once the ranch work was done, he would sit at the kitchen table across from her and read aloud sometimes, if she asked it, in a voice that was low and unhurried. And Annie found herself looking forward to those evenings with an eagerness that unsettled her a little, because eagerness for anything had become, in the months since her father's death, a foreign and slightly frightening sensation. Martha Sinclair came out from town every few days, ostensibly to check on Annie's recovery and to satisfy the demands of propriety, though Annie came quickly to understand that Martha's visits were as much for her own company as anything, a widow's habit of finding reasons to be useful to someone. It was Martha who told her, in the unhurried way of a woman passing on information she considers important but not urgent, about Wallace's wife. Her name was Sarah, Martha said one afternoon, the two of them sitting on the porch step while Annie shelled peas into a bowl balanced on her knee. "Sweet girl came out from Ohio with her folks when she was barely 17, married Wallace 2 years after that. They had 4 good years together before the typhoid took her. No children, which I know grieved them both something terrible, though neither of them ever said so plain. That was 2 winters back now. He's never said a word of it to me," Annie said. "He wouldn't. Wallace Doyle isn't a man who wears his grief where folks can see it and comment on it. But you'll notice, if you look, that this house has her hand in it still. The quilt on your bed, the flowers stitched in the corner Sarah made that, her last winter when she was already ailing and knew it, though she never said so to Wallace, not until near the end. He kept everything of hers exactly where she left it for the better part of a year before he could bring himself to put any of it away, and even now, I'd wager, there's things in this house he hasn't touched since she passed." Martha paused, glancing sideways at Annie with the shrewd, assessing look of a woman who has spent a great many years reading the undercurrents beneath what people say and don't say. "I tell you this not to burden you, child, but so you understand the man you're living under the roof of. He's not cold, he's careful. There's a difference, and I think you of all people ought to know it when you see it." Annie said nothing for a while, working the peas from their pods with more concentration than the task strictly required. "I'm not looking to be anything more to him than a hired hand, Mrs. Sinclair," she said at last. "I've had my fill of men's intentions for one lifetime." "I didn't say you were looking for anything," Martha said mildly. "I only said what I said." And she let the subject drop, though the small, knowing curve of her mouth suggested she had planted exactly the seed she intended to. By the start of summer, Annie had regained enough strength to take on the full run of a ranch wife's duties, though she was careful always to remind herself, and anyone who might be watching, that she was no such thing, merely a hired woman earning honest wages. She rose before dawn to start the stove and have coffee ready by the time Wallace and old Tobias came in from the early chores. She kept a garden that had, under the previous arrangement of a rancher too busy to tend it properly, produced mostly weeds, and within a month had it yielding beans and squash and the beginnings of a fine crop of tomatoes. She mended shirts and darned socks, and when the mood struck her, baked bread with a hand that had learned its craft at her own mother's side back in Kansas, before the fever that had taken her mother when Annie was only 12, leaving her to keep house for her father in the years since. Wallace, for his part, never once made her feel that her presence on his land was a favor extended rather than a fair exchange honestly earned. He paid her wages on the first of every month, counted out in coin same as he paid old Tobias, and when she tried once to refuse a portion of it, arguing that room and board ought to count against the total, he had simply set the coins on the table in front of her and said, "A day's honest work is a day's honest wages, Annie. I don't shortchange my hands, and I won't start shortchanging you." It was a small thing, perhaps, to an outside eye. But to Annie, who had spent the last year of her life being told, in ways large and small, that her worth was measured entirely by what a man decided to make of her, the steadiness of it, the plain, unbothered fairness of it, meant more than she quite had words for. The town of Larkspur itself she came to know gradually, in the trips she and Wallace made together for supplies, or the Sunday services she began attending at the small clapboard church, once she felt strong enough to sit through a sermon without her mind wandering back to Ellsworth County. Larkspur was not much of a town by the standards of places further east, a single dusty main street with Martha Sinclair's dry goods store at one end and the sheriff's office at the other, a livery, a blacksmith, a saloon that did modest business on Saturday nights, and the church that served on Sundays and doubled as a schoolhouse the rest of the week. But it was a town with a decent, steady character to it, the kind of place where people knew each other's business, but mostly used that knowledge for looking out for one another rather than tearing each other down. And Annie found herself, to her own quiet surprise, coming to feel something like belonging there, a sensation she had not expected to feel again in any place, let alone one this far from anywhere she had once called home. Sheriff Cole Hutchins was a broad, unhurried man in his 50s who had kept the peace in Larkspur for the better part of a decade, and who greeted Annie, the first time they met, with the same easy courtesy he extended to every soul in his jurisdiction, asking no questions about where she'd come from beyond what politeness required, though Annie suspected, from the careful way he mentioned once that he kept an eye on the roads coming in from the east, just as a matter of habit, that Wallace had spoken to him privately about the possibility of trouble following her west. It was on one of these town visits in early June that Annie first met Charlie Prout, the doctor's grown son, a pleasant, sandy-haired young man of perhaps 22, who ran the town's small feed and grain operation, and who made no particular secret of his interest in the new woman working out at the Doyle place. He was polite about it, bringing her a bag of seed corn for her garden one week and offering, unprompted, to help repair a wagon wheel the next, and Annie, flattered despite herself but feeling nothing beyond a friendly warmth toward him, was careful to keep the acquaintance exactly that. It was not Charlie Prout's earnest, uncomplicated attention that had begun, in the quiet hours of her evenings at the Doyle Ranch, to occupy more of her thoughts than she was entirely comfortable admitting. The night of the storm came in the second week of July, and it was, Annie would think later, the night everything between her and Wallace Doyle shifted from careful distance into something neither of them could any longer pretend not to see. The sky had been building toward it all afternoon, a green-black wall of cloud rolling up from the southwest, with the particular menace that Wyoming summer storms carried, full of hail and wind that could flatten a season's crop in 20 minutes and take a barn roof with it besides. Wallace and old Tobias had spent the afternoon getting the cattle moved down off the exposed ridge pasture and into the more sheltered draw near the creek, but as the light failed and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, it became clear that a dozen head of yearling calves had gotten separated from the main herd and were still up on the ridge, right in the path of what was coming. "I'll go," Wallace said, already pulling on his slicker, and Tobias, whose knees had been aching all week with the change in weather, made to follow anyway until Wallace stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "No, Tobias, you stay and get the horses settled in the barn, make sure that door's latched tight. I can manage a dozen calves on my own." "You'll manage them faster with 2 sets of hands," Annie said, already reaching for her own coat from the peg by the door, and Wallace turned to look at her with an expression caught somewhere between surprise and immediate refusal. "Annie, that ridge is no place to be once this storm breaks proper. Lightning, hail the size of a man's thumb, wind that'll take a rider clean off a horse if it catches them wrong. And you mean to go up there alone and all of that?" Annie finished for him, already buttoning her coat, "which strikes me as no safer for you than for me, except that with 2 of us we'll get those calves down twice as fast and be back under a roof twice as soon. I've ridden in worse weather than this, Wallace Doyle, and I won't stand here arguing about it while the sky finishes falling in." There was no time to argue further, and something in her flat, practical certainty must have convinced him, because he simply nodded once, sharp, and said, "Stay close to me. If I say turn back, you turn back. No arguing it in the moment. Understood?" "Understood." They rode up onto the ridge with the first real fury of the storm breaking over them, rain coming near horizontal on a wind that seemed to want to peel the hats from their heads, and found the scattered calves bawling and confused at the tree line, spooked by a crack of lightning that had split an old cottonwood not 200 yards distant. It was hard, cold, frightening work, the 2 of them working in a rough, wordless coordination born of necessity, pushing the calves down off the exposed ground and into the shelter of the draw, while hail began to fall in earnest, stinging where it caught bare skin, drumming a violent tattoo against Annie's hat and shoulders. One calf, more panicked than the rest, broke away from the group and bolted along the ridge line rather than down into safety, and Annie, without stopping to weigh the wisdom of it, wheeled her horse and went after it, catching the animal by a rope loop cast with more luck than skill, just as a bolt of lightning struck close enough that the air itself seemed to crack open, and her horse shied violently, nearly throwing her. She did not fall, but the moment left her shaking, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, and when Wallace reached her a few seconds later, having seen the whole thing from below, his face was white beneath the rain running down it. "Annie." His voice cracked on her name in a way she had never heard from him. "Annie, you could have been killed." "I wasn't," she said, though her voice was not as steady as she wanted it to be. "I've got the calf. Let's get it down before the next one hits closer." They got the last of the animals into the draw within another quarter hour, and by the time the worst of the storm had passed on to the east, leaving behind a torn, dripping quiet and a sky beginning to clear toward a spectacular wash of orange sunset, both of them were soaked through and shaking with cold and the ebbing rush of fear and effort. They walked their horses the last stretch back toward the barn rather than ride, both too spent to do otherwise, and it was in that slow, quiet walk through the mud and the last scattered raindrops that Wallace finally spoke what had clearly been sitting in his chest since the lightning strike. "When I saw that bolt hit in your horse rear," he said, staring straight ahead rather than at her, "I have never in my life been so afraid. Not since," he stopped himself. "Not since Sarah," Annie said quietly. It was the first time either of them had spoken her name aloud between them. Wallace's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it, nor did he flinch away from the subject the way Annie had half expected. "I couldn't do anything for her," he said. "The fever came on so fast, and Doc Prout did everything a body could do, and it wasn't enough, and I sat by that bed for 6 days watching her go, and there wasn't one thing I could do about any of it. I told myself after that I wouldn't let myself care about anything that fiercely again, because caring that much and not being able to protect it near broke me the first time." He finally turned to look at her, rain still dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes dark and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "And then you rode onto my land half dead on that mare, and I have spent every week since trying to convince myself I hadn't already broken my own rule." Annie's breath caught. The horses had stopped walking, or perhaps she and Wallace had simply stopped without noticing, standing there in the mud with the last light going gold and soft around them. I told myself the same kind of thing, she admitted, her voice barely above the sound of the last dripping rain. That I wouldn't trust any man's kindness again, because the last time I trusted a man's word, it near got me married to a monster. But you've never once made me feel like a burden, Wallace. Not once, not in all these months. You've made me feel like she struggled for the word, found it. Like a person, like I was worth something beyond what use could be made of me. I didn't know how starved I was for that until you gave it to me. Wallace reached out, slow, giving her every chance to step back if she wished it, and laid his hand against her cheek, his palm rough with callus and warm despite the chill of the rain-soaked evening. You were never a burden, Annie Yates, not for one single day. She leaned into his hand, and when he bent his head toward hers, she met him the rest of the way, and the kiss, when it came, was slow and careful and utterly without demand. The kind of kiss that asked a question rather than claimed an answer, and Annie found herself answering it with her whole aching, grateful heart. They stood like that in the mud and the fading light for a long while, and when they finally did lead the horses on into the barn, neither of them said much of anything more, but the silence between them had changed its character entirely, gone warm where before it had only been companionable, and old Tobias, watching them come in from the porch where he'd been keeping worried watch, took one look at both their faces and simply said, "Well, it's about time," before going back inside to see about supper. The weeks that followed the storm carried a new and quiet happiness into the Doyle ranch, the kind that neither Wallace nor Annie rushed to name aloud, but that showed itself plainly enough in the small ways they had begun to orbit each other, in the lingering touches when passing a dish at supper, in the evenings spent sitting together on the porch step long after the day's work was done, in the easy laughter that had begun to replace the careful politeness of their earlier months together. Martha Sinclair, upon her next visit, took one look at the two of them and announced, with the satisfaction of a woman whose predictions have been thoroughly vindicated, that she expected an announcement before the summer was out, and neither Annie nor Wallace found much cause to argue the point, though Wallace, ever careful, insisted privately to Annie that he wanted to do things properly, courting her the way a woman deserved to be courted, rather than rushing toward anything simply, because the feeling between them had grown so undeniable. It was at the town social held in late July, an event Larkspur put on every summer in the schoolhouse yard, with fiddle music and lanterns strung between the porch posts, and enough food brought by every family in the county to feed twice their number, that Wallace Doyle made his intentions known to the whole of Larkspur at once, in the way that mattered most in a town where everyone's business eventually became everyone else's business anyway. Annie had worn her one good dress for the occasion, a soft green cotton she had mended and taken in herself over the preceding weeks until it fit her properly again, filled back out as she was from months of good food and steady work. When Wallace came to claim her for a dance, in front of the assembled families of Larkspur, including a visibly disappointed Charlie Prout standing near the punch table, he did not simply lead her out to join the others turning slow circles to the fiddle's tune. He stopped first, in full view of anyone who cared to watch, and said, loud enough to be heard by those standing near, "Annie Yates, would you do me the honor of this dance, and every dance after it, for however many years the Lord sees fit to give us?" It was not, strictly speaking, a proposal of marriage, not yet, but every soul present understood exactly what it meant, and Annie, feeling the color rise in her cheeks under the weight of so many watching eyes, found she did not mind the attention nearly so much as she once might have, because the man asking was Wallace Doyle, and there was nothing in his question but plain, unhurried devotion. "I would," she said, and took his offered hand, and they danced together under the lantern light while the fiddle played and the whole of Larkspur looked on with the warm, approving satisfaction of a community that liked nothing better than to see two good, deserving people find their way to happiness. It was 2 weeks after the social, in the golden hush of an August evening with the crickets just beginning their chorus and the last of the daylight fading soft over the western ridge, that trouble finally caught up with Annie Yates, exactly as she had feared it might in the darker hours of those first weeks on Wallace's land, though by now she had allowed herself to believe, foolishly perhaps, that enough time and enough distance might have let the past lose its grip on her entirely. She was in the garden gathering the last of the season's beans when she heard the sound of a horse and buggy coming up the lane, and something in the particular rhythm of it, unhurried and deliberate in a way that felt more like intention than chance passage, made the hair rise on the back of her neck before she had even turned to look. Silas Grier had not changed much in the year since she had last seen him, still a solidly built man in his middle 30s, with a face that might have been called handsome, if it were not so thoroughly marked by an expression of perpetual, calculating satisfaction, the look of a man accustomed to getting what he believed was owed him. He was dressed well, a dark suit and a bowler hat entirely out of place amid the dust and sage of Wyoming ranch country, and he brought the buggy to a stop at the edge of the garden with the unhurried confidence of a man who did not expect to be told no. "Well now," he said, climbing down, his eyes traveling over Annie with an appraising thoroughness that made her skin crawl even from 30 feet away. "I have spent a considerable sum of money and no small amount of time tracking you across 3 territories, Annie. I confess, I hadn't expected to find you looking so well fed." Annie's hands went still on the bean vine, her heart hammering, but she made herself straighten and face him rather than retreat, because retreat, she had learned over the past year, was exactly the response that men like Silas Grier fed upon. "You've no business here, Silas," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever claim you thought you had on me, I never signed a paper agreeing to it, and no court in this territory or any other is going to hold a daughter responsible for debts contracted by her father without her signature or her consent." "Ah, but you see," Silas said, reaching into his coat and producing a folded document with a small, satisfied smile, "your father did sign a paper some years back, when I first extended him credit against the harvest. A rather thorough paper, as it happens, that names any heirs of his estate as jointly liable for the debt in the event of his death, and specifies that in lieu of monetary settlement, the debt might be discharged through, shall we say, a familial arrangement. My lawyer assures me it is entirely binding." "That's a lie," Annie said, though a cold thread of doubt was already working its way through her certainty, because she had never seen the original agreement her father made with Silas Grier, had only ever taken Silas's word for its contents, both a year ago and now. It was at that moment that Wallace came around the corner of the barn, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar buggy, and stopped dead at the sight of the stranger standing at the edge of his garden with a folded paper in his hand, and an expression that Wallace recognized instantly, from long years of dealing with men who mistook confidence for the same thing as right, as trouble of the worst and most patient kind. "This is private land," Wallace said, coming to stand beside Annie, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed hers, a silent and immediate statement of where he stood in whatever was about to unfold. "You'll state your business plainly, or you'll get back in that buggy and leave the way you came." "Wallace Doyle, I presume," Silas said, unbothered, extending a hand that Wallace did not take. "Silas Grier of Ellsworth County, Kansas. I've come to collect what is legally owed me. Miss Yates here inherited a debt from her late father, and I hold a document, properly witnessed and filed with the county clerk, establishing her obligation to discharge that debt through marriage to myself, as was arranged between her father and I before his passing." "Let me see the paper," Wallace said. Silas hesitated for the first time, a flicker of something less certain passing behind his eyes before he handed the folded document over, clearly confident that a rancher 2 territories removed from Ellsworth County would have no ready means of disputing its contents. Wallace unfolded it and read through it slowly, his jaw tightening as he went, and when he finished he looked up with an expression that had gone very cold and very still. "This document is dated 18 months ago," Wallace said. "It bears a signature purporting to be Thomas Yates, and a witness signature I don't recognize, and a county clerk's seal that any competent hand at a printing press could reproduce given enough motivation. It does not, however, contain a single word about marriage as a means of discharging the debt. It's a standard promissory note for credit against a harvest, same as any farmer might sign with any merchant, and the sum named is $40, which I'd wager is a sum this ranch could settle in cash before supper if it comes to that, and send you on your way with your debt paid in full and no further claim on Miss Yates whatsoever." Silas's composure slipped, just slightly, a tightness appearing at the corner of his mouth. "There is a secondary agreement, verbal in nature, between myself and Thomas Yates, regarding the terms of settlement in the event. A verbal agreement holds no weight in any court I've ever heard of, particularly one made between two men, neither of whom is available to confirm its terms, one being deceased and the other being you, a man with considerable financial interest in inventing whatever terms suit him best." Wallace folded the paper again, deliberately, and held it out. "I'll settle the $40 owed on this note right now, in cash, and you'll sign a release before witnesses stating the debt is discharged in full, or you'll take this matter to a judge, and I will personally accompany Miss Yates to that hearing and bring the sheriff of this county along besides, and we will see how well your verbal agreement holds up under oath in front of a magistrate who has no particular interest in helping a Kansas merchant coerce a grown woman into marriage against her will." For a long taut moment, nobody moved. Silas Grier's eyes flicked between Wallace's unyielding face and Annie's, taking the measure of the situation, calculating, as men like him always did, whether the fight remaining to be had was worth the cost of continuing it. "You'd stand behind her," Silas said finally, something almost like genuine curiosity in his voice, as though the concept were foreign to him. "A woman who arrived on your land with nothing, no family, no name that means anything in this county. You'd spend your own money and put your own standing at risk for her." "I would," Wallace said, without a flicker of hesitation. "And I'd do it again tomorrow, and every day after that, because Annie Yates is worth 10 of any man who tried to buy a wife with a forged debt and a threat. Now, do we settle this here, plainly and honestly, or do we settle it in front of a judge?" Something in Wallace's absolute steadiness, the complete absence of doubt or negotiation in his voice, seemed finally to convince Silas Grier that the path of least resistance and least public embarrassment lay in taking the $40 and going. Perhaps he had never truly believed his claim would hold under serious legal scrutiny, had counted instead on Annie's isolation and fear to make the whole matter easier than it now promised to become. Whatever his calculations, he took the money Wallace counted out from a tin box in the house, signed the release. Sheriff Hutchins was summoned to witness that same evening, and by nightfall was gone from Larkspur and from Annie Yates' life entirely. It was only after his buggy had disappeared down the lane in a trail of dust, and Sheriff Hutchins had ridden off with a promise to keep an eye on the roads for good measure, that Annie allowed herself to sit down hard on the porch step and finally shake with the delayed force of everything she had been holding rigidly still against for the better part of an hour. Wallace sat down beside her close and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him and let herself cry, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer overwhelming relief of a fear finally, truly laid to rest after carrying it clenched in her chest for the better part of a year. "He's gone," she said finally, once the worst of it had passed. "He's really gone. I don't have to look over my shoulder anymore." "You never have to look over your shoulder again," Wallace said, his voice rough with feeling. "Not while I've got breath in me to stand beside you." "You didn't have to do that," Annie said, turning to look at him. "You didn't have to spend your own money or put yourself between me and him that way." "Annie." Wallace took her face gently between both his hands, the way he had that evening after the storm, and looked at her with an intensity that stole the rest of whatever protest she might have made clean out of her chest. I would spend every dollar I own and every ounce of standing I've built in this county to keep you safe, and I would do it again 100 times over without a moment's hesitation, because I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the night I read to you from that old book of my mother's and you fell asleep before I finished the second act, and I sat there another hour just watching you breathe easy for the first time since you'd come to me, and I knew then that whatever was left of my heart after Sarah, it belonged to you now, whether I was ready to admit it or not. Annie's breath caught, tears rising fresh, though these were an entirely different kind than the ones before. I love you too, Wallace Doyle. I think I have for longer than I let myself believe, because I was so afraid to trust it after everything. But you've never once made me feel small, or like a burden, or like anything less than a woman worth standing beside rather than standing over. You filled every gap I came to you with, and you never once made me feel the shame of having those gaps in the first place. Then marry me, Wallace said simply, without preamble, dropping to one knee right there on the porch step with an urgency that made Annie laugh through her remaining tears. Marry me, Annie Yates, and let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never again have to run from anything or anyone, because you'll have a home and a name, and a man beside you who considers loving you the finest work he's ever been given to do. Yes, Annie said, laughing and crying both at once, pulling him up to meet her. Yes, Wallace Doyle, 1,000 times yes. They were married on the second Saturday of September in the little clapboard church in Larkspur, with the whole town turned out to witness it, Martha Sinclair weeping openly through the entire ceremony despite her own insistence beforehand that she would do no such thing, and old Tobias standing as proud a witness as if Wallace had been his own son. Doc Prout gave Annie away, since she had no family of her own left to do it, and Charlie Prout, gracious in defeat, stood among the well-wishers afterward and shook Wallace's hand with genuine warmth, declaring that he'd never seen a man look happier in all his days, and that he supposed some things simply weren't meant to be argued with. Annie wore a dress Martha had helped her sew from fabric bought at the very store Martha herself kept, pale ivory with small embroidered flowers along the hem that Martha had insisted on adding herself, in a quiet echo of the quilt that had first covered Annie on the night Wallace brought her home, though neither woman spoke aloud of the connection, letting the gesture stand for itself. The vows Wallace spoke that afternoon, in a voice that carried clear and steady through the small church, despite the emotion plainly moving beneath it, were vows Annie would carry with her for the whole of her life afterward. I promise to fill whatever gaps you carry, Annie Yates, not because you are lacking, but because that is what love does for love, freely and without keeping count. I promise to see your strength always, even on the days you cannot see it yourself, and never once to mistake your need for help as a need to be made small. I will stand beside you, not over you, for every day the Lord grants us together. The reception afterward filled the schoolhouse yard with music and food and dancing that carried on well past sundown, and it was there, amid the lantern light and the fiddle music that had first accompanied their courtship, that Annie found a quiet moment to speak with Martha Sinclair, who had become, over the preceding months, something very close to the mother Annie had lost so many years before. I don't know how to thank you, Annie said, for everything. The care, the company, the dress, all of it. You don't owe me thanks, Martha said, squeezing her hand. I've watched that man carry his grief alone for 2 long years, and I've prayed more nights than I'll admit for someone to come along who'd remind him what it felt like to hope again. You did that, Annie Yates, same as he did for you. Seems to me you were exactly what each other needed, and I don't believe in coincidence often, but I believe in it plenty when I look at the two of you. The years that followed brought their own steady rhythm of joys and small hardships, as any life on a Wyoming ranch inevitably does, but they brought them together, and that, Annie had come to understand, made all the difference in the world. The winter after their wedding proved a hard one, with snows deep enough to require Wallace and old Tobias to break trail daily just to reach the cattle sheltering in the draws. And Annie, far from staying safely indoors as some might have expected a new bride to do, rode out with them more days than not, having proven herself, over the preceding season, every bit as capable a hand as either man. A fact Wallace never once resented, but instead spoke of with open pride whenever the subject arose among the other ranchers of the county. It was in the spring of 1880, just past the one-year anniversary of the day Annie had first collapsed on Wallace's north pasture, that she told him, over breakfast one ordinary Tuesday morning, that she was carrying his child, and the joy that broke across Wallace Doyle's face in that moment was, Annie thought, the purest and most uncomplicated happiness she had ever witnessed in another human being. A joy entirely unshadowed by the grief of the daughter or son he and Sarah had never had the chance to raise, transformed instead into pure and forward-looking hope. Their first child arrived that autumn, a son, born on a clear October morning with Doc Prute in attendance, and Martha Sinclair pacing the kitchen in a state of anxious excitement that rivaled Wallace's own. They named him Thomas, after Annie's father, a small act of honoring a man who had never had the chance to see his daughter find her way to safety and love, and Wallace held his son within the hour of his birth with an expression of such open, unguarded wonder that Annie, exhausted and aching and happier than she had ever imagined possible, found herself laughing and crying at the same time all over again, a pattern that seemed, increasingly, to define the great turning points of her life, since the day she had ridden onto Wallace Doyle's land. 2 more children followed in the years after, a daughter they named Sarah Grace, in quiet and deliberate honor of the woman whose memory Wallace had never asked Annie to erase, but whose grief he had allowed to soften over time into simple gratitude for the years they had shared, and a second son, born in the spring of 1885, whom they named simply Wallace after his father, over Wallace's own mild protests that the world hardly needed 2 of him running around causing trouble. The ranch itself prospered steadily through those years, weathering the hard winters and the lean seasons the way all ranches in that country eventually learned to, through careful management and honest partnership between husband and wife who had long since stopped keeping any account of who contributed more to their shared success, because the question had ceased, sometime in those early years, to hold any meaning between them at all. Annie took over the keeping of the ranch's books, a task at which she proved considerably more skilled than Wallace himself had ever been, and it became a running joke between them, repeated at every social gathering in Larkspur where the subject of the ranch's finances arose, that Wallace Doyle had married himself a business partner disguised as a wife, and that he counted it the finest trade he had ever made. Old Tobias lived long enough to see all 3 children grow past their toddling years, dying peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1888, mourned by the whole family as though he had been blood kin rather than a hired hand, and buried in the small plot behind the ranch house where, some years later, Wallace and Annie themselves would choose to be laid to rest, alongside Sarah, whose grave Annie had tended with as much care and respect as if she had known the woman in life, a gesture that Wallace, in the quiet of many evenings over the years, told her had healed something in him he had not fully realized still needed healing. Silas Grier, for his part, was never heard from again in Larkspur or in the life of Annie Yates Doyle, though word reached the territory some years later, carried along the same channels of gossip and correspondence that carried most news across that vast country, that he had been convicted of fraud in a similar scheme perpetrated against another family in a neighboring county, and had spent several years in the Kansas State Penitentiary as a result. Annie received this news with a complicated mixture of feelings, relief chief among them, but also a kind of distant sorrow for whatever twisted path had led a man to build his life around taking from others what was never rightfully his to claim. She did not dwell on it long. Her life, by then, was too full of its own steady, ordinary joys to spend much time on old ghosts. On the 10th anniversary of the day Annie had first ridden onto Wallace's land, half dead and running from a life that had offered her nothing but fear and diminishment, the two of them stood together on the porch of the ranch house, watching their 3 children, Thomas, now 9 years old and already a competent hand with the horses, Sarah Grace 7, and fiercely determined to keep up with her older brother in every chore and adventure. And young Wallace just past his 4th birthday, and still mostly content to trail after his siblings, shouting demands to be included chase each other across the yard, in the long golden light of a summer evening. "Do you remember," Annie said, leaning against her husband's side, his arm settling naturally around her shoulders the way it had 1,000 times before and would 1,000 times again, "what you said to me that first morning, when I told you I meant to earn my keep and move on once I was able?" "I remember," Wallace said, smiling down at her. "I told you there was honest work here if you were willing." "I've been thinking," Annie said, "that you never once in all these years made me feel like I owed you for anything. Not the food, not the shelter, not the care while I was healing. You always made it feel like a fair trade, even when I know now it wasn't, not really. You gave me everything, Wallace Doyle, and asked for nothing in return but my company and my honesty." Wallace considered this for a moment, watching their children in the fading light, and then he turned to look at his wife with the same steady, unhurried tenderness that had first drawn her to him on a rain-soaked evening 10 years before. "I don't see it as I gave you everything, Annie. I see it as you rode onto my land carrying every gap that a hard life and a harder man had left in you, and instead of running from what needed filling, you let me stand beside you while you filled it yourself, piece by piece, with your own strength. I just made sure you never had to do it alone, and never had to feel small for needing the company while you did it." Annie reached up and kissed him then, slow and full of a decade's worth of gratitude and love, and around them the evening settled soft and golden over the ranch that had become, against every fear she had carried onto it a decade before, the truest home she had ever known. That night, after the children had been put to bed and the house had gone quiet around them, Annie sat for a long while by the window of the room that had once been meant for Sarah's children, and was now filled instead with the quiet breathing of her own son and daughter down the hall. And she thought, as she often did in such quiet moments, of the woman who had collapsed on a dusty pasture 10 years before, running on nothing but fear and a desperate, unformed hope that somewhere west of everything she had known, there might be a place that did not ask her to make herself smaller to survive it. She had found that place. She had found more than that. A man who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly, fully herself, who had filled every empty, frightened corner she had carried onto his land, not by making her dependent on him, but by standing steady beside her while she found her own strength to fill those gaps herself. It was, she thought, the truest kind of love there was, the kind that asked nothing but gave everything, that saw a person's need without ever once mistaking it for a lack of worth. Wallace came and found her there by the window, as he always did, and sat down beside her without a word, taking her hand in his the way he had every night for the past 10 years. And together they watched the last light fade over the ridge where he had first found her, two people who had each, in their own way, been running on empty, and had found in each other everything they had needed all along. Outside, the Wyoming night settled deep and starlit over the ranch, over the cattle sheltering in the draws and the horses standing quiet in the barn, and the children sleeping soundly down the hall. And inside, in the warm lamplight of the home they had built together from nothing but honesty and patience, and a love that had never once demanded either of them be less than they were, Annie Yates Doyle leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, and finally, completely, after all the years of running, allowed herself to simply rest,